King Charles thought he was walking into a private family briefing about tradition, legacy, and the careful future of the crown jewels. But the moment Princess Anne placed Prince Philip's final letter on the table, the air changed. One sentence shattered the room's calm, exposing a secret plan Philip had left behind. And Charles realized the crown had been judged before he ever wore it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not reach for the letter at first. He only stared at it, as if the paper itself had crossed a line no living person in that room dared to cross. Anne stood opposite him, composed but pale, carrying the burden of a daughter who had waited years to speak words she knew would wound her brother. Clarence House, the royal residence long tied to private decisions and family power, had hosted many difficult conversations before, but this one felt different. This was not a dispute over timing, seating, or ceremony. This was Philip's final instruction, returning to the center of the monarchy. Anne revealed the letter through a documented private account left with royal solicitors, and she made clear that Philip had intended it to be read only when the future of the crown jewels became vulnerable to personal influence. The crown jewels, the sacred collection of crowns, swords, orbs, and ceremonial treasures used to represent royal authority, were not just beautiful objects, they were symbols of survival. They carried history, conquest, sacrifice, and duty. That was why Philip's warning landed with such force. The crown jewel plan, the internal structure deciding how those treasures would be protected, assigned, and displayed in future reigns, was never meant to be controlled by Charles alone. Charles gripped the arm of his chair when Anne began reading. He heard his father's voice in every sentence, stern, unsentimental, impossible to escape. Philip had written that the jewels must never become tools of favoritism, image building, or private emotional bargaining. Anne did not soften the phrase. She did not look away. She knew Charles was hearing more than a rule. He was hearing a judgment from the man whose approval had followed him like a shadow all his life. The room tightened when Anne reached the final line. Philip had written that she, above all others, understood the discipline of the crown. Charles lifted his eyes then, stunned not only by the words, but by what they implied. Anne had not been chosen by accident. She had been trusted because she would not bend. Charles asked who else knew. Anne folded the page with deliberate care. She did not answer quickly. Her silence said enough. William already stood somewhere inside this secret, and before Charles could confront the full meaning of Philip's words, the room had to face the people most wounded by them. Every royal crisis has a document, but this one had faces. Charles sat in disbelief. Anne stood firm. Camilla watched the room measure her place, and William remained dangerously quiet. Philip's final letter was no longer ink on paper. It had become a mirror, forcing each person around that table to see exactly where they stood in the future of the crown. Charles felt the weight of two lives pressing against him at once. He was the king, expected to command the room, steady the family, and protect the authority of the monarchy. But he was also Philip's son, hearing words from beyond the grave that seemed to narrow his freedom before he could defend himself. The crown, in plain terms, meant not only the monarch, but the entire system of duty, ceremony, and inherited power that surrounded the throne. And in that moment, Charles understood why this mattered. If Philip's final judgment could limit how the royal family handled its most sacred symbols, then the crisis was no longer private pain. It was a challenge to the way power moved inside the palace. Anne did not step forward as a rival. She stepped forward as the keeper of a promise. She knew Philip had trusted her, not because she wanted control, but because she understood restraint. To Anne, discipline was not coldness. It was protection. She believed the monarchy could survive grief, scandal, and public anger, but it could not survive if its symbols were bent to serve personal comfort. Charles heard that message in her voice, and it wounded him, because it sounded like Philip all over again. Hard, clear, and impossible to bargain with. Camilla lowered her gaze when the discussion turned toward image, access, and symbolic privilege. She did not need anyone to accuse her directly. The words circled the room and still found her. Every mention of influence seemed to press against the fragile space she had built beside Charles. The queen consort had endured years of public judgment, but this was different. This came from inside the family. This came from Philip's final letter, and that made it harder to fight. William remained silent, but his silence had force. The prince knew the letter strengthened what he had already believed. Royal symbols could not be treated like rewards, apologies, or tools for repair. He felt the conflict sharply. Because Charles was his father, Camilla was part of the present reign, and Anne was carrying the voice of the past. Yet the future king also knew the next reign would inherit whatever this room decided. Then Anne revealed the deeper concern. Philip had feared the crown jewel plan was being shaped too closely around personal alliances instead of institutional duty. The plan, meaning the private structure for deciding how royal jewels would be protected, worn, and assigned, had become too vulnerable. Charles understood the blow immediately. The letter was not merely advising him. It was quietly questioning who he had allowed near the crown's most sacred symbols. Camilla finally asked whether Philip had named her directly. Anne turned one page slowly. No one moved. No one rescued the moment. And that silence led everyone back to the hidden moment that had made Philip write the letter in the first place. The crisis did not begin with the letter. It began years earlier, during one polished royal ceremony when a single private remark reached Prince Philip's ears and changed everything. What seemed like a passing conversation about jewels, rank, and future presentation became the trigger he never forgot. The moment he decided the crown's treasures needed protection from the family itself. Philip had heard enough before anyone realized he was listening. The evening was supposed to honor continuity, but beneath the surface, another conversation was taking shape. Windsor Castle, one of the monarchy's most important royal homes, and a place often used for state occasions, had become the setting for a private reception after a state banquet. A state banquet means a formal royal dinner held for national guests, where every seat, jewel, and gesture carries political meaning. That night, the talk turned from ceremony to image, from duty to appearance, and from history to how certain jewels might shape Camilla's public standing in the years after the Queen's reign. Philip understood the danger at once. To others, the conversation may have sounded practical, even harmless. They spoke of future portraits, ceremonial appearances, and which treasures could define a new royal chapter. But to him, every word carried a hidden risk. The jewels were not rewards. They were not tools for sympathy. They were not ornaments to repair wounds left by public judgment. Philip believed they belonged to the crown's continuity, meaning the unbroken line of authority and duty that keeps the monarchy larger than any one person. And in that moment, he felt a quiet anger settle inside him. Anne saw the change before anyone else. She later remembered it through a recorded private account shared with family solicitors, explaining how her father left the reception early, his face hardened by a silence sharper than any open rebuke. Philip did not need to raise his voice. He rarely did when his mind was fully made up. Anne understood that look. She had seen it in moments when he believed the family had drifted too close to vanity, comfort, or self-protection. That night, he was not merely irritated, he was alarmed. Philip began drafting instructions soon after. He did not write them as gossip, revenge, or complaint. He wrote them as a final guardrail. The crown jewel plan, the private structure for deciding how royal treasures would be protected, worn, and assigned, had to be restricted before personal alliances could shape it beyond repair. He chose Anne as the moral witness because she had never confused service with display. She could be difficult, she could be blunt, but she could not be easily persuaded by emotion. Charles now understood the letter differently. It had not been written in sudden anger. It had been born from a warning he had unknowingly ignored. With the buried trigger finally exposed, the family could no longer avoid the confrontation waiting in the room. Charles wanted explanation. Anne gave him truth. In the stillness of that private room, brother and sister stopped speaking as monarch and princess, and began speaking as the children of a man who had left one final command. The confrontation was not loud at first. It was worse. It was controlled, personal, and every word carried the weight of decades. Charles made the first move. He ordered the aides out with a sharpness that told everyone the briefing had crossed into dangerous territory. The door closed, and with it went the last layer of palace protection. Only Charles, Anne, William, and Camilla remained. The king no longer looked like a man receiving advice. He looked like a son, forced to answer for choices his father had judged in silence. Anne held her ground, not with cruelty, but with the hard calm of someone who knew she had carried Philip's wishes for too long to turn back now. Anne did not rush her answer when Charles asked why she had waited. She let the question hang, because the delay itself was part of the truth. Philip had not wanted the letter used as a weapon. He wanted it revealed only if the crown jewel plan became vulnerable to personal influence. The plan, in plain terms, was the proposed structure for deciding who could wear, access, display, or approve the use of major royal jewels in future reigns. That mattered, because those jewels were not private ornaments. They were symbols of authority, and if authority could be shaped by emotion, the monarchy itself could look fragile. Charles heard the explanation and felt the blow deepen. He had expected loyalty from Anne, but not surrender. He had expected pain, but not this kind of challenge. Anne faced him as both sister and witness, reminding him that Philip's warning had been preserved through a documented instruction attached to the letter, not passed around as family gossip. She had not broken silence through rumor. She had revealed it through a private royal record meant for this exact moment. Camilla sat rigidly while Anne spoke. The queen consort did not need her name repeated to understand the wound. Every reference to advisors, consorts, court circles, and image building seemed to close around her. She had fought for acceptance for years, yet now the very symbols of royal acceptance were being placed beyond her reach. Charles saw that hurt, and it sharpened his anger. William finally broke his silence. The prince said Philip's warning matched concerns he had already raised in private conversations with his father. Charles turned toward him, stunned by the calm in his voice. The future king was not attacking him. He was protecting what came next. Charles pushed back, insisting the crown could not be governed from the grave. Anne lowered the letter, then revealed the sentence that changed everything. Philip had given it legal weight, and once legal weight entered the room, the argument stopped being family pain and became royal power. The most dangerous part of Philip's letter was not emotional. It was practical. Beneath the grief, beneath the family tension, beneath Charles's stunned silence, there was a clause. One carefully written instruction turned a private warning into a mechanism of control. And suddenly everyone understood why Anne had carried the letter like a weapon she hoped never to use. Anne placed the attached clause beside the letter with a care that made the room feel colder. She did not celebrate the moment. She did not look like a sister winning an argument. She looked like a woman forced to deliver the final part of a message that had already broken enough hearts. Charles stared at the page, and the humiliation moved through him before the anger did. Philip had not simply warned him. Philip had prepared for him. That difference cut deeper than any accusation Anne could have spoken aloud. Anne explained that the instruction had been lodged with trusted legal advisors, connected to royal estate and ceremonial asset planning. Legal advisors, in simple terms, are the solicitors and specialists who preserve sensitive family instructions and make sure certain decisions follow agreed rules. Ceremonial asset planning means the private system for protecting royal items used in major state moments, including jewels, crowns, and historic symbols. This mattered because the clause did not remove Charles's kingship. It did something more painful. It limited how freely the crown jewel plan could be changed without consultation from a designated family guardian. Charles felt the room shift against him. He had spent his life waiting for the crown, carrying its burden, defending its future, and now his father's final words suggested that even the monarch needed watching. Anne saw the pain on his face, and sorrow softened her voice. She had never wanted this. She placed one hand near the paper, as if steadying it could somehow steady him too. But the truth remained. Philip had built a safeguard into the plan, because he feared personal pressure could one day reach the monarchy's most sacred symbols. Then Anne revealed the name attached to that safeguard. She was the designated guardian. William was named as the future confirming authority, once the next reign drew closer. The meaning was brutal in its simplicity. Anne would protect the structure now. William would protect it later. The jewels would not be shaped by comfort, apology, or palace influence. They would be guarded by duty. Camilla understood the consequence before anyone softened it. The clause meant she could not privately influence jewel access, ceremonial selections, or symbolic assignments without scrutiny. The queen consort sat still, but the wound was obvious. Her place beside Charles remained, yet the symbols around that place had been placed behind a boundary she could not cross alone. Charles finally asked whether the plan had already been activated. Anne held his gaze. Her answer was devastatingly simple. After today, yes. That single answer began the fallout, and the first person to feel its force was Camilla. For Camilla, the room did not explode. It narrowed. Every title, every ceremony, every jewel she had worn under palace lights suddenly seemed to carry a question mark. Philip's final letter had not shouted her name, but it had drawn a boundary around her influence. And when the door closed behind the king's advisors, she understood that something intimate had been taken from her. Camilla felt the fallout before anyone announced it. The meeting had barely ended when the machinery of the palace began to move with cold speed. Staff were instructed to pause every pending approval connected to jewels, ceremonies, portraits, and formal appearances until Anne and William reviewed the revised plan. That mattered because royal approval was not just paperwork. It decided who carried symbols, who stood beside power, and who appeared to belong without question. For the queen consort, that pause sounded like judgment. Charles stayed near her, but his presence did not heal the wound. He wanted to defend Camilla. He wanted to say that Philip's warning had been misunderstood, that Anne had pressed too hard, that William had chosen the wrong moment to support restraint. But the king also knew the truth was heavier than comfort. His father's final instruction had drawn a line around the crown jewel plan, and crossing that line would make him look careless with the very symbols he had sworn to protect. Camilla sat alone after the others had gone, staring at the sealed folder left on the table. A sealed folder, in simple terms, meant a restricted palace file that could not be opened or acted upon without proper authority. Its presence mattered because it turned emotion into process. Her hurt was no longer private. It had been placed inside a system. Charles stood by the fireplace, searching for words, but every sentence died before it reached her. His silence felt less like caution and more like abandonment. Then the second blow arrived. A senior aide confirmed that one planned jewel appearance would be withdrawn from the next formal event until the review was complete. The decision was quiet, but it carried a brutal message. Camilla could still attend. Camilla could still stand beside Charles. But the symbol meant to strengthen her public place had been removed. Success and suffering collided in the same breath. She had reached the center of the monarchy. Yet one letter from Philip had reminded her that the center still had locked doors. William's office received a copy of the revised control structure before evening. The prince did not need to speak for the message to be clear. The matter had moved beyond family grief and into future authority. Charles saw that shift and finally left the room to find Anne, not as king confronting a subject, but as a brother searching for one honest answer. But the answer Charles needed would not come from advisors, clauses, or palace folders. It would come from Anne herself. Away from the table, away from the courtiers, away from Camilla's wounded silence and William's controlled resolve, Charles and Anne finally faced each other as siblings. No palace machinery stood between them. No legal language softened the blow. In that private exchange, the king stopped defending authority, and Anne stopped carrying duty like armor. For the first time, grief entered the room. Charles found Anne in a smaller sitting room, holding Philip's letter after it had been folded back into its envelope. The storm of the larger room had followed him there, but it no longer sounded like anger. It sounded like loss. He looked at his sister and saw not an obstacle, not a guardian, not a royal force standing against him, but the one person who had carried their father's final command alone. Anne did not turn the moment into victory. She stood with the weariness of someone who had done the right thing and still felt punished by it. Charles asked the question that had been burning beneath every argument. Did Philip doubt him? The words came out quieter than before, stripped of command. Anne understood the pain inside them. She knew this was no longer about the crown jewel plan, the private structure deciding how royal treasures would be protected, worn, and assigned. It was about a son, wondering whether his father had trusted him with the very institution he had waited a lifetime to lead. That mattered, because monarchy is not only inherited power, it is inherited judgment, and Charles feared Philip's final judgment had reached him too late to answer. Anne answered with care. Philip did not fear Charles as king, she said. He feared the crown becoming too personal under pressure. He feared love, loyalty, guilt, and public image turning sacred symbols into private answers. Anne's voice changed as she spoke, and for the first time, her composure cracked. She admitted she hated being the one to reveal the letter because she knew it would wound Charles where no public criticism ever could. He had faced headlines, scandals, and years of waiting, but this came from inside the family. This came from Philip. Then Anne revealed the final handwritten note on the envelope. Protect the symbol, even from those who love it. The sentence landed differently from the clause, differently from the warning, differently from every cold instruction that had come before. Charles finally understood. The letter was not an attack on his reign. It was a demand that he separate love from guardianship, marriage from monarchy, comfort from duty. Philip had not tried to weaken him. He had tried to save him from confusing the heart with the crown. Charles left Anne changed, not defeated. He knew Camilla would feel the cost. William would measure the decision, and the palace would soon face the world. And when the palace doors opened to the outside world, the private wound became a national reckoning. By morning, the secret could no longer remain inside palace walls. Britain woke to a story that felt older than politics and sharper than gossip. A father's final letter, a stunned king, a sister's duty, and a crown jewel plan suddenly pulled into the light. The monarchy had survived scandal before, but this felt different because it touched the symbols people thought were untouchable. The country did not receive the news gently. A front page carried the imperial state crown under the headline, Philip's Final Warning, and the words cut through breakfast tables, radio bulletins, and every quiet palace office where the story was being tracked. The imperial state crown, in simple terms, is one of the monarchy's most famous ceremonial crowns, used at major state moments to represent royal authority. That mattered, because this was no longer a private family disagreement. The argument had reached the object people connected with sovereignty itself, and once that symbol entered public debate, Charles could no longer treat the crisis as something contained behind closed doors. Charles watched the morning coverage in silence. The king had faced public judgment before, but this was different because his father's name had become part of the national conversation. Philip was no longer only remembered as a stern husband, father, and royal servant. He was now being discussed as the man who had left a final warning about how power should be protected. Charles felt the sting of that framing. If he resisted the letter, he risked looking careless with tradition. If he accepted it, he would admit that Anne had been right to challenge him. Anne felt no victory as the reaction grew louder. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and the division was impossible to ignore. Some praised her as the only person brave enough to defend Philip's intent. Others called the revelation painfully severe. A sister's duty turned into a public wound. Anne understood both sides, And that was what made the praise feel hollow. She had not wanted applause. She had wanted the crown to survive a mistake before it became permanent. Broadcasters seized on the deeper meaning. One presenter described it as the moment the crown jewels stopped being decoration and became evidence of power. The phrase landed because it made the hidden conflict simple. Jewels were not just beauty, they were access, rank, memory, and legitimacy. Camilla heard that language too, and the queen consort understood how sharply the world was now measuring her place. Then came the strangest public gesture. A small crowd gathered near Windsor Castle and left flowers by the gates, not as mourning, but as respect for Philip's final act of guardianship. The gesture unsettled Charles, because it showed the public had already chosen what the letter meant. It was not cruelty, it was protection. William read the coverage with controlled focus, aware that the future had entered the present faster than anyone expected. Charles now had to decide whether to resist the letter or turn Philip's warning into a defining act of kingship. And in the end, the king's choice revealed what the crown still demanded from everyone who served it. The verdict did not come through a dramatic speech or a palace spectacle. It came through one quiet decision. Charles accepted Philip's final instruction. Anne remained guardian of the plan. William became its future protector, and Camilla was forced to accept a boundary she could not cross. In that moment, the crown did what it has always done. It survived the people who wore it. Charles made the choice with the heaviness of a man surrendering something he once believed was his alone to carry. He formally accepted the revised crown jewel plan, allowing Anne's guardianship role to stand and confirming William's future oversight authority. The crown jewel plan, in simple terms, meant the private structure deciding how royal treasures would be protected, worn, assigned, and approved in future reigns. That decision mattered because it restored order where emotion had begun to blur the lines. It told the family that royal symbols did not belong to personal preference, marriage politics, or emotional compensation. They belonged to the institution. Charles felt the pain of yielding, but the pain no longer felt like defeat. The king understood, at last, that Philip's letter had not been written to shame him. It had been written to protect him from one of monarchy's oldest dangers, confusing love with authority. He could defend Camilla as his wife, but he could not let that defense reshape the sacred symbols of the crown. That truth wounded him, because it demanded restraint in the place where his heart wanted comfort. Anne felt the weight lift, though not completely. She had honored Philip without destroying Charles, and that mattered more to her than any victory. The guardian role had never been a prize. It was a burden passed from a father who trusted her discipline to a daughter who understood the cost of obedience. Anne knew her brother would remember the hurt, but she also knew the monarchy had been pulled back from a dangerous edge. Camilla accepted the boundary with quiet bitterness. Her influence over jewel-related decisions was permanently narrowed, not as public punishment, but as a quiet constitutional boundary inside the family. A constitutional boundary means a rule or limit that protects the structure of royal duty, even when private feelings push against it. William's role became clearer than ever. The prince was not simply waiting for the crown. He was already being trained to guard its hardest truths. This moment proved that the monarchy's deepest strength is not affection, image, or personal loyalty. It is restraint. Philip's final letter stunned Charles, wounded Camilla, burdened Anne, and steadied William. But it also saved the crown jewel plan from becoming a family possession. The crown survived because one final instruction forced everyone to remember that its symbols are bigger than any one heart. And with that decision, Philip's final warning became Charles's most painful lesson, and the crown's clearest act of survival. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.